Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. A warm welcome to the third webinar organized by the Rammohun Roy 250 Appraisal Society. And today's session, we have Professor Lynn Zastoupil from Rhodes and Dr. Michael Fisher from Oberlin College. And this webinar will be presided by Srimati Tanika Sarkar. So I will be asking Tanika Di to take care and take over the proceedings. Welcome, Tanika Di.
Thank you. Welcome, friends, to the third lecture in the series organized by Rammohun 250 Group. It's a special pleasure to welcome Professor Lynn Zastoupil and Professor Michael H. Fisher, our speaker and discussant respectively, for this session. After Professor Zastoupil finishes, Professor Fisher will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will have a question-answer session for about 15 minutes. Neither speaker requires an introduction, so I'll be very, very brief. As Amit said just now, Professor Zastoupil teaches at Rhodes University, where he offers courses on modern Britain, modern Europe, British Empire, and South Asia at the Centers of South Asian Studies and Media Studies. And he teaches a very exciting course on the British Empire through films, and I wish I could have attended those lectures. His major monographs include, of course, Rammohun Roy and the Making of Victorian Britain, which is a very intriguing title. It was brought out by Palgrave Macmillan, 2010. We are all familiar with it and have learned much from it. His John Stuart Mill and India was published by Stanford University Press in 1994, and he has co-edited with Martin Moore a very interesting book replete with primary documents, The Great Indian Education Debate, Curzon Press 1999, and also with Moore and Douglas Pearce, J.S. Mill's Encounters with India. That's Macmillan 2010. Professor Fisher was educated at the University of Chicago and Trinity College, Hartford. He taught at Oberlin College until 2016, and he has also taught at universities of West Washington, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and closer home, Delhi and Hyderabad. Beginning with his Visions of Mughal India, an anthology of European travel writings, Taurus, London, 2007, he has developed a whole new genre about flows and counterflows of Indian and European travelers between East and West, focusing in several important monographs on fascinating life histories. His Counterflows to Colonialism, Indian Travelers and Settlers in Britain, 1600-1857, which Permanent Black brought out in 2007, is a classic. And his most recent monograph is Environmental History of India, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. So it's a real pleasure before us. Professor Zastoupil's lecture is titled Rammohun Roy, Celebrity Unitarian. So you have the floor now, Professor Zastoupil.
Thank you, Tanika, for a very kind introduction. And I also want to thank, excuse me, Amit and the members of the commemorative committee for inviting me to participate today. I'm deeply honored to do so. I first became seriously interested in Rammohun as part of a small project I had in mind at the time, which would have been a study of his visit to Britain, and I had in mind an article that would look at this as part of that phenomenon that historians then were calling the voyage in, made by people from South Asia, Africa, and elsewhere to Britain during the days of empire. And if I had completed that, it would have been a minor contribution to a field now populated by major works by many distinguished scholars, including Mike Fisher, who's with us today. And I'm sure most of you know Counterflows to Colonialism, a fantastic book. Get my plug in there for you, Mike. But when I got to the archives in Britain, I was quickly sidetracked because I realized Rammohun wasn't an ordinary visitor from South Asia, from India, but actually a celebrity, and indeed a celebrity of the first rank. And I was, as I said, sidetracked. I found myself following the paper trail of his fame and coming across people, social customs, technological innovations, institutions, and so on that I previously was not really interested in or didn't even know anything about. Just a couple of examples. The actress Fanny Kimball, her very famous family, acting family, the social world that actresses and aristocratic men where they met and had encounters. This was all news to me until I read of Rammohun viewing Kimball perform from the Duke of Devonshire's box. The black sheep of the royal family, the Duke of Sussex, I had never had any interest in or even paid any attention to until I found a hitherto unknown presentation letter from Rammohun to the Duke mentioning a visit to Kensington Palace. I probably knew a little bit, excuse me, about the opening of in 1830 of the railway line between Liverpool and Manchester, one of the very first, if not the first in the world. But I would never have guessed that newspaper editors would find Rammohun's train ride worthy of notice in their papers, or that when he got to Manchester, he would be mobbed by factory workers in a manner suggestive of what happened to Gandhi 100 years later. And I could give you other examples. Rammohun being seated in the Royal Pavilion at the opening of the new London Bridge, the newspaper that had found space to devote to telling its readers what hotel Rammohun was staying in when he arrived in London, the Unitarians who stood up on benches so that they could see him, get a glimpse of him when he entered a meeting. The evidence of his celebrity status is quite strong. But more important are, of course, the things associated with that celebrity. I quickly came to realize that Rammohun was a celebrity. He was famous, really, before he ever set foot in Britain. And that there were multiple reasons for his celebrity status also became apparent quite quickly. But above all, and this gets me to my topic today, it became clear very soon that I would have to know something more about Unitarianism than I did if I wanted to appreciate why he was so renowned, and not only in Britain, but in North America. And I'm going to share with you today what I discovered when I dug deeply into that story of Rammohun and his engagement with Western Unitarianism. I'm going to divide my talk into three parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk about his initial engagement with Unitarianism while in Bengal, and discuss a little bit of the significance of his contribution to Unitarian discourse. Then I'm going to explain why this was central to his celebrity status in Britain, all those people wanting to meet this famous man. I'm going to talk about that. But then finally, I'm going to conclude with some ways in which Rammohun used Unitarianism to navigate his way through the colonial world he inhabited. So, part one, the precepts of Jesus controversy. Rammohun's interest in rational religion, as I'm sure everybody, or nearly everybody in this audience knows well, did not begin with his engagement with Western Unitarianism. I don't have time to address this today, but I will mention that his Vedanta publications first brought him notice in the West as a Hindu reformer, the Luther of India, as some called him. And this primed Western audiences for what was to come. His first publication against Sati also helped create a receptive audience outside of India, and not only because of his opposition to Sati. The Baptist missionaries publicized Rammohun's 1818 dialogue, praised his skills in scriptural exegesis, and thanked him for forcing defenders of sati to enter the public world of religious debate as then conducted by Europeans. When he turned to Unitarianism, Rammohun demonstrated just how thoroughly he had mastered that form of religious disputation, much to the chagrin of those very same Baptist missionaries. I'm referring here, of course, to the famous controversy between Rammohun and Joshua Marshman that erupted after the 1820 publication of the Precepts of Jesus. Marshman was deeply offended by Rammohun's work for various reasons, most of which stem from the fact that it was inspired by Unitarian ideas about Jesus and Christianity. Indeed, Rammohun produced his work the very same year that Thomas Jefferson, for the second time, produced a similar work. Both Rammohun and Jefferson rejected Orthodox Christianity, but came to a similar understanding of a different notion of Christianity. And this was due to the influence of Unitarians in their respective countries. For Jefferson, this was Joseph Priestley, one of the key figures in the early history of Unitarianism. For Rammohun, it is an unknown Scotsman. These encounters led both Jefferson and Rammohun to claim or at least endorse a particular type of Christian identity. A true Christian is one who follows the rational precepts of Jesus. This was a definition Unitarians could accept, but Orthodox or Trinitarian Christians, such as the Baptist missionaries, could not. For someone like Marshman, the idea of Jesus as a mere teacher violated his deepest convictions about a divine Savior whose sacrifice atoned for the sins of humanity. Now, before I proceed, a word of caution about Rammohun's religious identity. His interest in Hindu, Islamic, and Christian rationalist traditions makes this a complex subject to which I can't do justice here. Instead, let me make two observations pertinent to my talk. First, Anglo-American Unitarians generally pride themselves on a fundamental principle of individual conscience, meaning each person was free to interpret scripture in their own way. This meant that people of any and all, or even no biblical leanings were welcome. Their congregations were famous, notorious in the eyes of their opponents, for attracting members from various Protestant denominations, Jewish and Muslim visitors, as well as some Jewish converts, political radicals escaping persecution, and others. As a friendly observer noted about a prominent London chapel, it was a place frequented by persons of all beliefs and no particular beliefs. Hostile observers saw this differently, often describing Unitarianism as a resting place or halfway house to all kinds of heresy and atheism. I find it helpful to think of Unitarianism as opening a permeable space at the margins of Christianity, a space that individuals could occupy temporarily or permanently with few commitments to doctrine. Rammohun and Jefferson both found this congenial. A true Christian is someone who follows the teachings of Jesus. One important reason to think that this is true in Rammohun's case is the fact that while he was in Britain, he gave serious thought to standing for Parliament, even though he knew full well that were he to be elected, the oath of office at that time included the phrase, "upon the true faith of a Christian." My second observation on the matter of his religious beliefs is to point out that all the conflicting testimony and evidence, and there is plenty of this, regarding Rammohun's beliefs and practices cannot obscure the fact that he mastered the discourse of rational dissent in a fashion that impressed Western audiences. The evidence for this from the Unitarian side is copious. The Boston Unitarian editor David Reed, for example, produced in 1828 the first complete North American edition of Rammohun's works from the Bengal controversy. And he repeatedly proclaimed in his newspaper that the last of Rammohun's contributions placed him in the very first rank of Christian theologians. In 1827, W.H. Drummond, a Dublin Unitarian minister, published a pamphlet arguing that the doctrine of the Trinity is neither scriptural nor rational. I'm going to mention those 2 points in just a moment. Drummond not only cited several of Rammohun's arguments in the body of his text, he did so on the title page just beneath a quote from the Gospel of Mark. Drummond also dedicated his pamphlet to Rammohun in prominent fashion. Amit, if you could give me screen sharing privileges, I'll share the screen.
You are sharing the screen.
You can see it?
Yes.
Okay. On the left of my slide is the title page from Drummond's pamphlet, The Doctrine of the Trinity, founded neither on scripture nor on reason and common sense. These are the 2 main points that Unitarians made always in their arguments. And underneath this, and I have on my next slide, I have this enlarged, we can look at it more closely. The first is a quotation from scripture, the book of Mark, and then a quotation from Rammohun, the longer one. But before I turn to that and talk about it in a little more detail, just point out the dedication page to Rammohun Roy, the learned Christian Brahmin. Unitarians would not have found this contradictory to refer to him as both a Christian and a Brahmin. In fact, that was a term they often used. And then the other dedicee was William Ellery Channing, a prominent Boston Unitarian. Here's an enlargement of the 2 quotations. Again, the brief quotation from the book of Mark. And this is, of course, something that the Unitarians prided themselves on. They were convinced the Bible did not support the idea of a Trinity. But they also tended to argue quite frequently that Trinitarianism was not really, it didn't make sense, it wasn't rational. And this is, for that part of the argument, Drummond uses a quotation from Rammohun, where, as you can see, he says, the doctrine of the Trinity appears to me so obviously unscriptural, and then goes on to say that no one possessed of merely common sense would fail to see this, unless, and this is a point I'll return to later, unless previously impressing the early part of his life with creeds and forms of speech, preparing the way. In other words, only people indoctrinated since childhood in the doctrine of the Trinity could believe it. But it wasn't only Unitarians who were persuaded by Rammohun's exegetical skills. Non-Unitarians, I'm trying to think of a generic term. Trinitarian is the term that the Unitarians like to use to describe their opponents. Orthodox Christians, maybe I'll stick with that. They could also recognize Rammohun's talents as a Unitarian disputationist without agreeing with his conclusions. In 1821, for instance, Thomas Middleton, the first bishop of Calcutta and no friend to the Unitarians, acknowledged this. Rammohun, he wrote, I'm going to quote him directly, makes out his anti-Trinitarian case quite as well as Landcarpenter or Belsham. Landcarpenter and Thomas Belsham were 2 leading British Unitarians of the day. In 1826, two missionaries from a different organization conversed with Rammohun in Bengal, and they concluded that he was a pretty consistent Socinian. Socinian was an epithet used by Orthodox for the Unitarians. And the two missionaries went on to say that he was, and again I'm quoting directly, perfectly skilled in the tactics of Socinian controversy and defended himself and his notions with as much ability and discretion as any person of similar tenets whom we have encountered. Secular writers were often noted that Rammohun seemed to be very good at this as well. And I'm going to just give one example here, and that's from the Literary Gazette of London, a magazine which noted that they didn't really publish articles on religious matters or theological disputes, but they felt compelled by Rammohun's visit to London to examine his defense of Unitarianism. And the author of the piece concluded that this was so well done that surely the brightest ornaments of the Church of England would be obliged to respond. Now, what impressed contemporaries was a blend of biblical exegesis and rational argument found in Rammohun's appeals to the Christian public. This was an approach, as I've already suggested, that was typical of British Unitarians, and it explains why friends, foes, and neutral observers alike were convinced of his religious identity. I'll give three examples here. To the Orthodox argument that Jesus claimed knowledge equal to that of God, Rammohun followed Unitarian convention in pointing out that in the Gospel of Mark, there's a passage where Jesus reveals his ignorance of the day of judgment, which is known only to God. Rammohun also joined Unitarian controversialists in denouncing the doctrine of atonement for requiring intellectual contortions to explain how God can suffer pain and death, and suggesting that only prejudice inculcated from an early age, that quotation I read to you just a moment ago, suggesting that only prejudice so inculcated could lead to belief in these doctrines was a third standard argument used by Unitarians. So now part two of my presentation, Rammohun, the celebrity Unitarian. The precepts of Jesus controversy propelled Rammohun to celebrity status in the West. In 1822, the Baptists produced a London edition of Joshua Marshman's early volleys in the controversy, and the Unitarians responded in 1823 and 1824 with London editions of Rammohun's contributions. New York and Boston Unitarian editions followed in 1825 and 1828. There were also several posthumous editions. The editors of all of these volumes in various ways made clear that they considered Rammohun one of them. The 1824, 25, and 28 editions also all contained a similar portrait of Rammohun with his signature underneath. The original of these portraits was produced in Kolkata by the French artist Philippe Samniock in 1822. The evidence suggests that Rammohun sent copies of this portrait to Unitarians in Britain and the United States. The copy I found was collected by Jared Sparks, a Baltimore Unitarian minister and later president, and later president of Harvard College. Sparks corresponded with Rammohun in the early 1820s. Samniock's portrait, unlike the ones that were reproduced, contained written text, which is very interesting, including a brief description of Rammohun as someone who had given up the present Hindu religion and openly embraced Unitarianism. Since it is virtually certain that it was Rammohun himself who sent this portrait to the West, I think it's understandable why Unitarians were convinced that he was one of them. And I'm going to show you now the original of Samniock's portrait plus the 2 copies made. This is, I presume everyone can see this, I hope so. This is the copy I found of Samniock's portrait. And it is the one that becomes the basis of the ones that were produced by new artists or reproduced by new artists in London and New York. And on my next slide here, I'm going to enlarge the lower part so we can see the text. And I will zoom in as well to make it even. So you can see right underneath the actual portrait drawn and engraved by P. Samniock. Then his name is not a signature, of course, it's a fair copy. The text that describes him as a learned Brahmin who has given up the present Hindu religion and openly professed Unitarianism, and notes that he is defending Unitarianism with his talents and wealth and his pen and so on. And then at the very bottom, the date, which is helpful, drawn from the life and engraved and published by the artist in Calcutta in 1822. This is the copy of that produced by an unknown artist in London for the Unitarian editions. It shows up, as far as I could tell, only in 1824 as both the frontispiece to the 1824 edition of Rammohun's works from the Controversy in Bengal, as well as frontispiece to a volume of a Unitarian magazine. Different here, of course, is the text underneath mostly just consists of a lithographed reproduction of Rammohun's signature, which would have been known to many Unitarians in Britain by this time because he was corresponding with many of them. And this is the New York version, produced by the engraving firm of Annan and Smith, and it appears as the frontispiece to the 1825 as well as 1828 edition, North American editions of his work. And again, his signature is reproduced for readers. I would argue this is a celebrity portrait. When Rammohun arrived in Liverpool in April of 1831, newly made copies of it were in every print shop in the city, according to his travel companion, James Sutherland. It was also widely reproduced in the next few years, usually along with his signature in various magazines and other places. The British Museum managed to get a copy with the original of Rammohun's signature, meaning not a reproduction of his signature. This is why I would argue this is a celebrity portrait. Like we might today if we have a photograph of a famous person, we get a chance to get their signature, we do it. That's what the British Museum did. The Duke of Sussex inserted the portrait as a frontispiece to one of Rammohun's volumes in his own library, and amateur artists made copies of it, pencil and watercolor copies. I think it's fair to say it's a celebrity portrait. And it's, evidence of his celebrity as well as testimony perhaps to why Unitarians were convinced he was one of them, if we remember the original of this. But it's important to recall why British audiences were celebrating Rammohun, why they were so eager to see this image. And they were primed to view him as an important person or to pay attention to what he had to say by a long history of religious disputes in Britain about the Trinity. When Rammohun produced the Precepts of Jesus, one of those controversies was still simmering in Britain over an 1808 critical edition of the New Testament produced by the Unitarians. But this was just the most recent in a long line of controversies that dated back to the middle of the 17th century. These invariably involve two people, two authors writing to each other or to trying to convince their audiences that the person they were disputing was wrong. Each cited their favorite biblical passages and were convinced that they were right. Needless to say, they almost never converted or persuaded anyone. They were in many ways just preaching to the choir, as the saying goes. And this situation led one exasperated champion of the Trinity to proclaim in 1722 that he had finally found passages in the Bible that were so plainly supportive of the doctrine of the Trinity that, quote, a Turk or an Indian that reads them without any prepossession would certainly understand most of them so. Now, a Unitarian, of course, promptly answered with a pamphlet titled A Sober Appeal to a Turk or an Indian, making the usual Trinitarian arguments and inviting an fictitious foreigner to serve as a unprejudiced or unbiased umpire to decide the case. Joshua Marshman was keenly aware that when Rammohun published the Precepts of Jesus, British Unitarians were poised to claim him as that unbiased umpire. And this is exactly what they did. Unitarian references to Rammohun as an unbiased, unprejudiced foreigner who, after diligent study, had concluded that the doctrine of the Trinity was not scriptural are plentiful. I'll just give the best example of this I found. And this is from a memorial sermon that the Belfast Unitarian minister J. Scott Porter gave after Rammohun's death. The 1722 appeals had suggested an experiment that had now been concluded. Rammohun, Porter wrote, is the Indian contemplated at that time, and after full and impartial study, the unbiased Bengali, quote, has published to the world his conviction that the doctrine of the Trinity is not to be found in the Bible. Now let me turn to another way we can examine Rammohun's celebrity status as a Unitarian controversialist. And this additional evidence can be found in a little-known edition of one of his works published in London by the Unitarians just after his death. This was a reprint of his second appeal to the Christian public, originally published in Kolkata in 1821. This was the work that many Unitarians, not all of them, but many consider to be his finest contribution. This 1834 edition, however, bore a new title, A Treatise on Christian Doctrine. And I'm going to share the screen again so you can see that. And I'm going to zoom in. I found two copies of this work, by the way. One is in Dr. Williams' library in London, a great library for those interested in the history of dissenting thought in Britain. And then another copy at Harvard in the theological library. And this is where I found, this photograph is from the Harvard copy. As you can see, a treatise on Christian doctrine, but then the subtitle being the second appeal to the Christian public in defense of the precepts of Jesus. On this edition, they've given him his title that he got shortly before he came to Britain, the Raja Rammohun Roy. It's described as the second London edition. And then down here at the bottom that is reprinted for the British and Foreign Unitarian Association. Why this new title? I would answer it was another way to claim Rammohun as a celebrity Unitarian. Let me explain. Because of the long history of discrimination and legal persecution that non-Trinitarians had faced, in Britain, denying the doctrine of the Trinity only was legally tolerated after 1813. Many of those holding unorthodox views tended to keep them to themselves. Hence, ferreting out famous examples of closet Unitarians became a popular activity of later Unitarian writers. Until 1825, John Locke and Isaac Newton were the two most prominent individuals so claimed. But in that year, 1825, a recently discovered Latin manuscript by John Milton bearing the title De Doctrina Christiana was published by royal authority, revealing the famous English poet's very heterodox religious views. Unitarians were quick to respond. As one prominent editor noted, Unitarians may now claim as their own, in addition to the mighty names of Locke and Newton, the not inferior name of Milton. An English translation of De Doctrina was also published in 1825, and it bore the title, A Treatise on Christian Doctrine. And this is still Rammohun's, this is Milton's. I'll also zoom in so you can see that a little better. This is Milton's, the title page of Milton's treatise, the English version, published also in 1825. Is it coincidence that the 1834 edition of Rammohun's Second Appeal was given this same title? I don't think so, given the kind of things I've been talking about today. And also, if one recalls, that Milton's work exploded on the British public scene a year after the Unitarians published the complete version of Rammohun's works from the Bengal controversy. I think in the Unitarian bind, these were two volumes, two contributions to their cause that they wanted to celebrate. But let me turn to something different here, and that's the kind of so what question my students are always asking, or at least have implicit in their minds. What came of this celebrity status? And I would argue influence. Rammohun's interest in other matters, liberty of the press and ending sati, for example, drew him into contact with reform-minded Britons who had little or no interest in theological disputes. But these reformers recognized that Rammohun's celebrity status would help them advance their own causes. For instance, those who advocated freedom of the press. One of their favorite arguments was that liberty of the press was a great engine of social progress. When the East India Company announced, or reintroduced, I should say, restrictions on the press in Bengal in 1823, expelling James Silk Buckingham, the radical editor, and suppressing his newspaper, among other measures, this fed into existing outrage in Britain about recently introduced press restrictions there, the so-called 6 Acts. British radicals were quick to seize on Rammohun's response to the Bengal situation, which of course included a memorial to the Supreme Court, a petition drafted along with others to the Privy Council, and the announcement that he was closing down in protest one of his newspapers, the Persian language Mirat al-Akhbar. In those documents, Rammohun advanced multiple arguments for a free press, including the ones that were particularly of importance to people in Britain, and that was intellectual progress. Rammohun's arguments made their way into speeches and publications produced by British champions of liberty of the press, who often enough quoted directly from one or more of Rammohun's works. Those did so knew that his voice would get a hearing among the reading public. I guess we would call him a social influencer. Buckingham is a prime example of this. Everyone knows Rammohun, Buckingham wrote, because of his writings against Orthodox Hinduism, his embrace of Unitarian Christianity, and his campaign against sati. There could be no better proof, Buckingham noted, of the value of liberty of discussion and the dissemination of knowledge than the writings and actions of the justly celebrated Rammohun Roy. Another critic of the East India Company, Robert Rickards, made the same point. Despotism was holding back India from reaching Europe's level of development, which owed much to the intellectual progress made possible by the printing press. Providing India with the same advantages, especially the printing press, would transform the subcontinent as it had Europe. Proof of this already existed, Rickards added. The writings of, and I'm quoting directly from Rickards here, the writings of that extraordinary man, Rammohun Roy, are too well known to require encomium from me. His celebrated petition to the king on behalf of a free press for India, his precepts of Jesus, his appeals to the Christian public, his defense of Hindu theism, translations of the Upanishads, and various other tracts are works that will immortalize the name of Rammohun. Rammohun's fame brought him influence even after his death. The Bristol Unitarian physician, John B. Estlin, attended Rammohun in his final illness and snipped some locks of Rammohun's hair after his death for keepsakes. I'll show you a photo here of those locks. This was supplied to me by the Bristol City Museum and Library. They also have, by the way, his Rammohun's eyeglasses at the time of his death. I also ran across in the British Library a file where one lock of Rammohun's hair could be found as well. Some of you may have seen that as well. Now, locks of hair, even just single strands of hair, which might be put in a locket and worn around the neck, often by women, were quite popular at the time. Interesting here, of course, is one particular use that was made of these locks, and that was to support American abolitionism. British Unitarians and Quakers tended to be staunchly anti-slavery, and after the 1833 Emancipation Act, many used their religious networks and contacts in America to support abolitionism in that country. Estlin and his daughter Mary are examples of this. In 1844, they sent 6 locks and 6 strands of Rammohun's hair to a Boston Unitarian named Samuel May to be sold at a fundraiser there. These anti-slavery fundraisers were, as one American historian put it, the most dramatic and visible indications of American women's participation in anti-slavery during this period. Samuel May wrote back to the Estlins that he was sure the keepsakes would find ready purchasers at the fundraiser. Interesting is that 4 years prior to this, American women who had attended the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London had returned from that convention with locks of hair from the great abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, which had been given to them by Clarkson's daughter-in-law. Given this kind of attention to Rammohun and the kind of company he was placed in, so to speak, with his locks of hair, among transatlantic women involved in anti-slavery, are we maybe not safe in concluding that it was a Unitarian woman who penned, probably in 1833, an anonymous tract asking the United States Congress to abolish slavery immediately? The concluding sentence to this early abolitionist pamphlet makes this seem to me as likely as not. And I'm going to quote the final sentence of that pamphlet. In closing this address, allow me to assume the name of one of the most enlightened and benevolent of the human race now living, though not a white man, Rammohun Roy. Okay, now part 3 of my presentation. And thank you for bearing with me this far. This part of my paper I'm calling, or presentation I'm calling Provincializing England, and I say that with apologies to Dipesh Chakrabarty because I stole the title from him. Now, many of you have noted so far that I've really presented Rammohun primarily as an extraordinary person because of how he was perceived in the West. Let me now restore some agency to him. 1823 was a pivotal year in Rammohun's Unitarian career. In January, he published the last and longest of his solemn learned responses to Marshman. The 300-page rejoinder that Marshman published soon after may have persuaded Rammohun that this form of disputation was going nowhere. In May, he took up a different approach, one familiar to him from the Indian tradition, but also clearly inspired by his Unitarian connections. The result was new possibilities for both challenging missionaries, but also challenging British officialdom. That month, May 1823, he translated into Bengali dialogue between a Trinitarian missionary and 3 Chinese converts, a satire that had been published 5 years previously in a London Unitarian magazine. This satire mocked the doctrine of the Trinity by having 3 Chinese converts rely on their common sense and the plain meaning of words to answer 3, 2, and none to the question posed by the missionary, how many gods are there? That same month, May of 1823, Rammohun adopted the persona of an Orthodox Brahmin, Ram Das, to mock the Orthodox Christian views of an East India Company surgeon, Robert Tytler. After enough pestering by Tytler to debate the doctrine of the Trinity in the newspapers, Rammohun hit upon the idea of instead using a persona, Ram Das, not to debate, but to appeal to Tytler for an alliance of orthodoxy against Unitarianism. This alliance was possible, Ram Das insisted, because Orthodox Christianity and Hinduism were on a par since each believed in multiple gods, in the reality of divine incarnation, and the inadequacy of human reason to comprehend divine mysteries. Rammohun, we would say today, was trolling, and Tytler took the bait, as did some others. Rammohun may have been prompted to turn to mockery by events from the previous year. In July of 1822, Thomas Middleton, the first bishop of Calcutta, I've already mentioned him, died and was buried in a manner suggestive of a state funeral. Rammohun wrote an obituary in his Persian newspaper, noting that Middleton believed in the glorious Trinity, and ended it by noting, I'm quoting here from Buckingham's English translation of the obituary, which concluded, Middleton now reposes in the bosom of the mercy of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. One member of the Governor and General's Council, William Bailey, took offense, arguing that Rammohun's known Unitarian views made it plain what this reference to the Trinity was all about. Bailey was also upset by Rammohun's response to a local newspaper editor who also found the obituary inappropriate. Rammohun had replied to that editorial by stating that everyone knows what Orthodox ministers preach about the Trinity every Sunday, so he had assumed that this was what they believed. But, and I'm quoting here from Bailey's translation of Rammohun's response to the editorial, But, Rammohun continued, since it seems the mere mention in the Persian language of the essential principles of the Christian religion is an aspersion of the faith professed by the Governor General and all its followers, I shall therefore avoid this fault in future. In this episode, Rammohun anticipates the rhetorical strategy of the anonymous Unitarian dialogue between a Trinitarian missionary and 3 Chinese converts. The strategy was to mock Orthodox Christianity by taking literally the plain meaning of words. There can be no God, as the 3rd Chinese convert answered the missionary, because you have taught us that there is only one true God, and he was executed a long time ago. Bishop Middleton and the governing class of Bengal are polytheists who believe in a God the Father, a God the Son, and a God the Holy Spirit, because that is what they openly proclaim in their houses of worship. Now, this last episode is another reminder, by the way, of the larger significance of Rammohun's celebrity status as a Unitarian controversialist. Middleton died the year after Rammohun published his second appeal, which I've already noted was seen by many Unitarians as his most significant contribution. Others saw it that way too, including Middleton. I think Middleton had that in mind when he wrote that Rammohun was quite good at Unitarian disputation. And I think it is this growing fame or reputation as a Unitarian controversialist, particularly right after the second appeal, that explains why Bailey and that newspaper editor read Rammohun's obituary comments the way they did. This was no innocuous mention of the Trinity, but a derisive one by a Unitarian of growing reputation. The derisory tone of Rammohun's comments at a solemn moment for the colonial regime, I would argue, was rightfully taken by Bailey as a subversive act. And the subversive strategy that Rammohun was employing here, again paraphrasing Deepesh here, was to provincialize Bengal's colonial rulers, starting with the faith of the majority of them. Orthodox Christianity was not unique, but a local version of a widespread phenomenon. Why should Hindus give up the many gods, their many gods, for the 3 preferred by Westerners? Why turn away from familiar accounts of incarnation for the one accepted by most Christians, especially since, as Rammohun liked to remind his opponents, Asia was home to the original manifestation of this. As Rammohun wrote in one of his later Ram Dass letters, God has never chosen to manifest himself in the flesh in any quarter of the world but Asia. And this was doubtlessly so, Ram Dass went on, because Asians have always been his most favorite people. After he arrived in Britain, Rammohun continued to put the British in their place. Now, you could draw on other sources for this. His early admiration for Napoleon is one example, and this continued with an open enthusiasm for the Second French Revolution that led to a visit to Paris in 1832. After that visit, Rammohun's views on the Whig ministry in Britain took a sharply negative turn, which some people attributed to French influences. In any event, whatever the English might think of their own political institutions, Rammohun found alternatives. Across the Atlantic Ocean, another rival for his admiration was emerging. Contacts with American Unitarians persuaded Rammohun that he should visit that nation, which he held up as a beacon of hope for being the land of liberty. Freed from the shackles of a state church, the United States would no doubt see the restoration of pure Christianity sooner than would England, a laggard nation in Rammohun's view. And this was also true in the political realm. It's not clear what Rammohun had in mind when he wrote, a prominent Liverpool Unitarian, that if the Great Reform Act of 1832 had not passed, Rammohun wrote, I would have renounced my connection with this country. But now, he added, since it had passed, he could feel proud for being one of your fellow subjects. The context for this letter, political reform, suggests that his thoughts were on France or the United States. Since he complained, like many a tourist ever since, that without French it was hard to get around in France, I think it's more likely that he had America on his mind, especially since he had maintained correspondence with many American Unitarians and had invitations to visit there. In any event, what is readily apparent is that Rammohun saw options to remaining a colonial subject. Britain wasn't the center of his universe. It was catching up on political reform, he would give them that, but still lagging in religious progress. Other nations, however, might be more deserving of his allegiance and his presence. And I think Rammohun's celebrity status helps account for these sentiments. There's a suggestive confidence in many of his letters and recorded conversations during his final years in Britain. He chastised, for example, in person, a leading politician for voting against the Reform Bill. He confidently discussed British political matters. This displeased Lord Ellenborough, the Tory political leader and future Governor General of India, who attributed it to unnamed radicals who Ellenborough thought had given Rammohun radical notions on English affairs, which Ellenborough thought ridiculous for Rammohun to express. In fact, he got up and left, he wrote in his diary, when Rammohun started to talk like that. Now, Ellenborough didn't indicate what Rammohun said or might have been starting to say about political affairs, but we get glimpses of that from other sources. And I'm going to close with just one example, I think a very interesting one. In 1832, an anonymous person reported a conversation where, when asked what he thought of monarchy, Rammohun, quote, smiled and said he did not know what to say to that, end quote. But then our reporter noted he went on to say, quote, he could not sympathize with the English and their partiality for monarchy, end quote. And then our reporter noted Rammohun went on to point out that the Old Testament contained a warning from Jehovah against choosing a king. The patronizing smile at one of Britain's venerable institutions and the supporting biblical reference ready at hand, these are not surprising for the seasoned Unitarian controversialist that Rammohun had become. And I think the confidence to express these things the way he did comes from knowing that he was a very famous person. The implicit nod in the direction of a republic could be owing to other influences, but Unitarian mentors are as likely as anyone else for pointing out that the first book of Samuel could be employed in support of the Republican cause. In any event, his quick resort to this particular biblical passage places Rammohun in some interesting company. Thomas Paine used the same passage to denounce the British monarchy in his influential pamphlet from the American Revolution, Common Sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zastoupil, for a very rich and very thoughtful lecture. I would now ask Professor Fisher to begin his discussion of this paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to the Society for organizing these webinars and its convener, Shri Das. Also to Professor Sarkar for sharing of this seminar. For those who haven't had the pleasure yet of reading Lynn's work, particularly his Rammohun Roy and the Making of Victorian Britain, I would suggest strongly that you do so, because it's really a very rich account, and the book gives him scope to expand on a number of points that he made here. The high points of the lecture, as I appreciate them, is how he makes the argument that Raja Rammohun Roy's close engagement with Unitarianism in Bengal before his departure for Britain, and then especially as a respected authority, even arbiter of theology among humanists and Unitarians in Britain and the US, gave him tremendous influence. His celebrity and influence were based on his publications, advocating progressive views about key issues of the day, and also his powerful intellect, deep knowledge of Hindu and Christian theology, skillful mastery of exposition, rhetoric, and rational logic, as well as his charismatic personality. Now, complementing and reinforcing Professor Zastoupil's discussion of Raja Rammohun Roy's influence in the US on Unitarians, there were, of course, other means other than going through London by which his influence had a great deal of effect in particularly the Boston area among Unitarians there. There were many of American trading vessels that went directly to Calcutta, particularly after 1783, when American independence freed it from the constraints of the East India Company's monopoly, and then going on throughout Rammohun Roy's life. And so he was known very much in New England by letters back and bringing back of his publications by Americans in Calcutta. I think if we can share his screen here, I believe this is it. Are you seeing his the portrait?
Yes.
Very good. So an American artist, Rembed Peale, went to London and just before Rammohun Roy's death, portrayed this, I think, very sensitive and appreciative portrait. This is now in New England at the Essex Peabody Museum. And so that we have this idea of Americans looking to Rammohun Roy, not necessarily through London, but through connections directly to Calcutta. One of the reasons that there were so many American ships was because as neutrals they could trade, but they were trying to export goods that Indians would want. And there wasn't much that New England produced at the time that was appreciated in London. One of the things that was appreciated was ice. And so that you have a very large trade going up to hundreds of tons of ice from New England rivers and ponds that were packed into ships, very carefully bound up. About 2/3 of the ice that left New England actually got to Calcutta, the rest melted. But it was very appreciated because the kinds of ice that were made locally were not this crystal clear, very hard ice. So that you have ships bringing ice to Calcutta as well as Mumbai, as a way to sort of establish some sort of balance of trade. Now, the ideas that they brought back, and here's the Calcutta Ice House as of 1851, so that you find, I'm not sure exactly where in Calcutta it was, but I suspect you probably know. So that you have this trade going on, and as the influences from Rammohun Roy and his followers left Calcutta and came to New England, they affected not only Unitarians, but then later Transcendentalists. So for example, Henry David Thoreau, intellectual and spiritual and even physical, felt a connection with people in Calcutta. He wrote in Walden, "I go to my well for water, and lo, there I meet the servant of a Brahmin, the priest of Brahma, Vishnu, and Indra, who sits at his temple in the Ganges reading the Vedas. Our buckets, as it were, grate together in the same well. the pure Walden water is mixed with the sacred water of the Ganges. Now, this is intellectually, but it's also, I think he's suggesting physically that water from Walden was melting and going into the Ganges in Calcutta. So you have these kind of connections. And if you'd like to read more about it, there's a very good study by Susan Bean called Yankee India that looks at these sorts of things. It's published by the Peabody Essex Museum in the US, but by Mappin in India, so it should be available there. Now, when we have Rammohun Roy in London and in the US, he was facing a great deal of opposition, in part because of the developing ideas in Britain about race. So I think that we can appreciate the power of Raja Rammohun Roy's accomplishments in Britain and the US by looking at the kinds of opposition and the kinds of issues that he had to face. Many people in Britain in the 1820s and into the 1830s and then beyond were developing ideas about race that really were increasingly biological kinds of racial connections, so that he found opposition to his arguments not only from Unitarians or Orthodox Christians, as Lynn calls him, but also because he was considered to be a Black man, and this was a developing idea in Britain. And so there are accounts in high society where Rammohun Roy was being celebrated in soirees by society ladies, and you have men mumbling in their beards about, quote, what is that Black fellow doing here? Why is he entering into society? Now, many of the people who were detractors had connections to India, and so that you're really seeing importation of the developing racial barriers in the East India Company that are being imported into Britain. William Thackeray, who was himself born in India, lived in India during Rammohun Roy's lifetime, later in his fiction ridiculed Roy using the character of Rumman Lal in the Newcomes, for example, a petty merchant who claimed royalty. And he also, Thackeray did, really scolded British society hostesses for fawning over Roy while he was in London. So despite this kind of social opposition and these critiques, Roy was still very influential, as Lynn has pointed out. Similarly, in the US, race was a growing important issue and one that really put him into an argument about whether non-whites had the same capacities and rights as whites did. And so that many of the abolitionists used him and other non-whites as examples of accomplishment. The other major issue that Rammohun Roy had to deal with throughout his time in Britain was that he was an ambassador from the Mughal Emperor Muhammad Akbar, Akbar II. When Akbar was looking for someone to represent him, Muhammad Akbar, he anointed Rammohun Roy as a Raja, promoted him, if you will, and also designated him as a plenipotentiary and ambassador, an Illichi, from himself, the Mughal emperor, directly to the British crown. And one of the key issues was whether the pension that the Mughal emperor had been receiving, according to the 1805 treaty that took over the Delhi area, was how much he received in his pension. The Treaty of 1805 promised the Mughal emperor the revenues from the Delhi territories, whose revenue had raised up to about 30 lakh a year. But the emperor himself was only getting a small portion of that, only 12 lakh. And so that he was looking for someone who could go to London, who could be financed out of the emperor's pension, and then could persuade the British to enhance his presence, his pension, and also connection to the British royal family. And so that at the same time that he's making these theological arguments and engaging in a number of progressive causes, Rammohun was also an ambassador who was battling against the establishment. Before he left India, the Delhi resident tried to stop him, to cancel a mission. They put pressure on the heir apparent to denounce the mission. They tried to stop him from leaving They rejected his credentials, and nonetheless, Rammohun was able to get to London. Once in London, he attended the coronation of King William IV, seated among the foreign ambassadors in Westminster Abbey. So his role was really as a formal ambassador to the British Crown. And during his years there, he was constantly negotiating with the East India Company's Court of Directors and the British government about this pension. Rammohun Roy hired lobbyists. He penned a pamphlet called The Treaty with the King of Delhi, which he published in 1831, that was very much revealing of the duplicity of the East India Company. And rather than distributing it, he threatened to distribute it widely unless the Court of Directors negotiated in better faith. And finally, he was able to get an increase in the pension from 12 lakhs annually to 15 lakhs. Now, that's only still about 50% of what was due, but it was at least something. And Rammohun Roy had to accept this modest increase if the emperor agreed to relinquish any claim on the rest of the income. So the point of all of this is simply to say how Rammohun Roy had really dual role as a progressive leader, a Unitarian, a man very interested in progressive patterns, but also an ambassador from, if you will, a feudal or archaic kind of Mughal empire. Further, while Rammohun Roy was in London, his bank, as we know, crashed in Calcutta, and he had to appeal personally to the Court of Directors for a loan in order to survive. The directors, therefore, had a strong handle over him. They demanded that a, quote, respectable person be the guarantee of the loan. And when Rammohun Roy offered himself as a personal guarantee, they refused it. So they're really trying to humiliate him. On the other hand, Roy had very strong personal relationships with some very influential members of the Court of Directors who had to informally support his theological and his political, his social reform elements, while at the same time trying to suppress his political arguments. So I think when we look at his roles in the West and how he perceived, you find a very complex and very varied sets of views depending on which Rammohun Roy we're talking about. And certainly his personal charisma and his theology was what we're focusing on today. So in that sense, I think we can complement what Professor Zastoupil suggested about Rammohun Roy's role in London. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fisher. And indeed, the two lectures complemented each other very, very, very effectively and brought out the political and religious alliances and oppositions, as well as the racial opposition and the sheer racism in the reactions, which I really didn't know anything about. And we look forward to a rich discussion as well. I'll ask the, I'll ask people to put their questions in the chat box and raise their hands if there's not much time, and be brief in their questions. Are there questions already?
I do not see any questions in the chat box.
May I then just ask a preliminary question?
There's two hands raised. One is from Dipishda and others from Rosinka.
Then I will ask them to go ahead.
Rosinka, why don't you go ahead and I'll go after you. I mean, after you speak, yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Dipishda. Let me try and get the video up. Yeah. So I'll try and, this is really about, I mean, it is the question about Rammohun, but not directly about Rammohun. It's to ask for some illumination on a subject that I'm, more or less ignorant about. I was interested a few days ago looking at a post somewhere, in fact, that mentioned the quotation from Walden that Professor Fisher showed us right now about the waters of the Ganges mingling with the ice from the pond at Walden. But what was also in that particular post was a link to Charles Wilkins' translation of the Bhagavad Gita, which I'm sure you know, the dialogues of Krishna and Arjun. What interested me about that introduction to that translation was a reference to Unitarians. Now, this was intriguing because it's interpreted completely differently. So, if you allow me, just quickly, if I can read that sentence from the preface to the 1785 translation of the Bhagavad Gita. So Wilkins is saying that the most learned Brahmins of the present times, so quickly in my head, so this is 1785, so I'm presuming somewhere at this time in 84, 85, that when he's in Banaras, working with this Pandit Kalinath, where he's saying that the most learned Brahmins of the present times are Unitarians, according, he says, though, to the doctrines of Krishna. Now, this interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita as a Unitarian text that is arguing for one God against the polytheism of the Vedas, the word Unitarianism used with a capital U over here in the preface. At first, I was confused and I thought, is he saying there are Unitarian Brahmins around him in Banaras at this time in 1785? And then I read it more carefully and I saw that no, it seemed to be what he thinks they're saying. So to cut a long story short, I don't want to take up too much time. I just wanted to ask both speakers today, really, whether they could say anything at all about this period, 1785. Rammohun is, very young. Whether they have any sense at all of this unity of the Godhead being interpreted in other ways. So of course, Rammohun is very much from within the Christian framework, but I'm just wondering whether there is a discourse in place that anyone has any knowledge of of an interpretation of Hinduism itself, or at least the Gita itself, as a Unitarian text, or the dialogues of Krishna being a Unitarian text. What that says about Rammohun's later, whether Rammohun had read Wilkins, perhaps. I'm not a Rammohun scholar, so I just wanted to know whether Rammohun had perhaps read Wilkins, what he thought of the Gita. I was just, these questions came to my mind just from this one passage in the preface to Wilkins' translations of the Gita. So that was one. And the other, very quickly, and this I'll just, just in a sentence, Lynn mentioned this wonderful 1844 auction in Boston among the abolitionists. I was wondering whether he had any knowledge at all about George Thompson, who visited Calcutta in 1843, and of whether Thompson was in fact associated with the Unitarian Church at all in any way. I haven't managed to find the facts about that, so I just wanted to know whether they, so again, these are both are tangential questions really, but I'd be grateful if some further light could be thrown on these matters. Thank you. Deepeshda, do you want to go, I mean, should the questions be collected in the interest of time, or?
Could depend
depends on how Tanika decides, but my question is different.
Depends on Professor Zastoupil actually and Professor Fisher, how they want this to proceed.
Sure.
Let me try to respond first to the two questions that Rosinka posed. First of all, 1785 sounds very early for the reference to learned Brahmin Unitarians, and so my first question would be: is the dating of that preface, that edition, something that we can be sure about? I'm not saying that it isn't, because it is possible. Certainly, when Westerners first encountered Rammohun's writing, Vedanta publications, the first thing that came to mind, they all thought of him as a deist. In fact, that's kind of the standard terminology used to describe him when they first encountered those writings. And so it's possible this is something along that, this kind of a rationalist approach, and so on. But it does sound that if you had just read that quote to me and didn't give me a date, I would have said, oh, this is somebody who has Rammohun Roy in mind, learned Brahmin, Unitarian, etc. But 1785, of course, is way too early for that. About George Thompson, I never came across any connection between him and Rammohun, but maybe Mike did, who I know also did quite extensive research.
Well, I don't have a great deal of that. I'm just wondering whether we're thinking of Unitarian only as the sort of the Christian idea, or whether that reference isn't in Wilkinson to really an Advaita kind of a model or understanding of Hinduism, in which Unitarian obviously means something very different.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Shall I ask my question now, Tanika?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, look, first of all, thank you, Lynn and Mike, for wonderful lecture and great response, and learned a lot. And one question I have a few, but one I'll pick for today is, and it's to both of you, but it comes out of Lynn, your lecture and your observation that Rammohun's connection to Unitarians made him a famous man and an influential person. But it's really the question of fame. I mean, I'm interested in kind of exploring the question as to whether or not there could be comparative histories of what fame was and is in different parts of the world at different times. Because as you will remember, that when the Delhi court, before the Delhi court selected Rammohun to be its ambassador, they hadn't heard about him. And the emperor's sons were saying, why, this is a man we haven't heard about. A bit like, the way that Syed Ahmed Khan would react to Bengali officials. So these are people without pedigree, we haven't heard of him. And so clearly in the late Mughal world, he was not a famous man. So my question is, if you were to contrast what constituted fame in the late Mughal world and what constituted fame in the world that Rammohun Roy negotiated, in the European world, would one then see that fame was made up of different ingredients in the two cultures?
I would almost certainly say yes, because as I think I put in the introduction to the volume, but I didn't mention here, is of course fame really tells us more about the society doing the celebrating than the person, right? And people in Britain and in particularly the Boston area, but not just Boston, but North America, who were interested in this religious question, even on both sides of it, they couldn't help but notice that Rammohun was somebody that they had to pay attention to. So this tells us much more about the condition of, or the nature of, or let me put it this way, it tells us a lot about the importance of a religious dispute that today almost nobody debates, but that mattered a lot to people in Britain and North America at the time. And Rammohun was celebrated because of that. It tells us, it's a glimpse into a world of religious disputation. Just to give you one example, one of the London Unitarians that he was close to, William J. Fox, later went on, he was quite young when he met Rammohun, he later went on to become a social reformer, political activist, member of parliament, so on. So he had a long career. His biographer noted, had to discuss Fox's early career as a Unitarian controversialist, and all the biographer could say is, well, that's an outmoded form of debate. meaning didn't even bother to read it because today we're no longer interested in it. But it was very important at the time, and the fact that Rammohun was celebrated for that tells it was an entry into a world that has kind of receded. And you would know the nature of renown in early 19th century India better than me, but what I do know of it, yes. I mean, of course, Rammohun, I think, had already acquired some local reputation through the public disputation, the public debates, and the circulating manuscripts of his time. But that was, of course, also of a different nature. But that's a great question. Fame is relative.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I might add, if I might, I also, I think that the whole issue of contingency, that fame when someone with agency or influence selects you and promotes you. And when you're talking about religious and political disputes, what you want is support. You want evidence in support of your cause. And sometimes the most distant or the most unexpected person, if you can recruit them and say, well, look, even they are appreciative of this. So that it's really a question of happening to pick one person or picking someone that you can help your cause, but not necessarily that the person who is selected is always the one who has the agency. And when we're looking backward, we tend to say, oh, he was selected, he's important, let's look at his life. So there's a retrospective empowerment that I think goes on.
Would you like to respond to Dipesh's question about why he was selected by the Delhi court?
I
don't know. So I can't help there.
Well, I mean, one argument I remember, Mike, in the documents that J.K. Majumdar reproduced, was that the court was eventually persuaded because they said there is this Brahmin called Rammohun Roy to whom the European listens. And so it's some kind of fame, but he was absolutely unknown, and as far as I remember, the Mughal princes were extremely dismissive of the idea of actually appointing this man who had no pedigree as to as high a position as the ambassador for the court, for the emperor. Yes, and finally, what I remember is this very pragmatic argument that, look, the Europeans listened to him.
Yes.
And we are trying to communicate. Yeah, sorry.
And if I can expand on that, the Delhi resident was very much lobbying the princes to repudiate him, and so that they may have been speaking as tools of the British as well as their own lack of interest.
That's interesting.
And didn't Rammohun's one of his ancestors, his grandfather perhaps, had been an agent of a previous emperor, if I recall correctly? Mike, you might remember that better than me.
No, I think your memory is clearer than mine.
Yeah. Sorry, if I can just add one more footnote to this discussion, which I found very funny when I was reading through the documents, is that, I mean, Rammohun Roy was such a shrewd bargainer. I mean, the eventual contract he had with the emperor, as far as I remember, had a clause that would, if he had been more successful and not died, that would have had the emperor paying to his family in perpetuity.
Yes, he got a cut of whatever increase.
Yeah, whatever they're going to get. And I was amazed by this Brahmin's, shrewdness, intelligence, whatever you want to think about it. As a poor Bengali Brahmin, I felt quite proud of his skills in bargaining.
Rammohun seemed to be good at business. Excuse me.
Sorry.
I just wanted to say that Rammohun was good at business dealings.
Yeah, that was very obvious.
Very good. Yeah, indeed. But he was also one of the few Brahmins or Hindus who would dare to cross the seas at that point of time without fear of losing caste.
Yes, the whole Kalapani issue, yes. Because a number of people of his status in Calcutta and elsewhere either didn't go, or when they did go, they had to go through a purification on their return. He didn't return, so we don't know if he would have had to go through this, or whether his sort of Brahmo connections would mean that he was freed of it.
I see a load of compliments to both of you, but Are there more questions?
I don't think we have questions, but definitely a rejoinder for what Professor Fisher said. I think Dwarkanath Tagore would be soon following Rammohun's footsteps in going to
several
England.
times. He went more than once, indeed.
Yep.
Yeah. So may I ask a very naive question to Professor Zastoupil?
Yes.
I was just wondering, how would Unitarians, because I know I know very, very little, how did Unitarians address the question of Holy Ghost and, the God the Son?
Excuse me, if you have more to ask, or I can answer that point.
Yes, please do.
Oh, okay. Yes. Well, there were various arguments. Some thought of a universal religion in which, or a universal set of, I guess we could call it religion. Confucius, Socrates, Jesus, Muhammad, they would put them all in the same category as humans who were somehow had access to divine truth and were passing along. Others thought that Jesus was on a divine mission, had been sent by God to teach humanity how to live right. So that would have been an alteration of that. But they all would have agreed that Jesus was a human, and that the idea of a Holy Spirit or a Holy Ghost was something probably added, that those ideas were added by some later convert to Christianity. I mentioned that new edition, or the critical edition of the New Testament that London Unitarians produced in 1808. In that they have explicit parts of the text where they say, well, this was likely an interpolation or an addition by an early convert from the Roman period or something like that. And they were convinced that the earliest editions of the Bible, the New Testament that could be found, did not make mention of these things. So that's what they thought. These were additions. I think Rammohun cited a familiar argument in one of his works where he said this was probably added by some person who believed in, polytheist was the term they used at the time, added by an early Christian convert, polytheism, because they were so used to it in the Roman period. Therefore, they added it, and it became accepted over time.
Thank you. Other questions? I had a weak connection, so I couldn't catch everything, I'm afraid. Mike, did you tell us how long it took in Rammohun's times for letters and books to reach from from India to England and vice versa?
I didn't mention it, but in the sailing days and before the Suez Canal, and going around south of Africa, around the of Good Hope, it would sometimes 3 or 4 months each direction. And of course, you had to wait for the monsoon. So we're talking about maybe a year round trip as roughly average, either to the US or to Britain. There were also ways that you could go overland. And there were certainly a number of people who went up the Red Sea and then overland what would become the Suez Canal, and then in the Mediterranean through France. And so there were a couple of ways to go, but it was very long, no telegraph at that point. And so that you're really talking about very distant in time kinds of exchanges.
So the fame was also staggered fame in a sense.
Yes.
Time-wise, something he wrote would reach there quite late. And
you're absolutely right. And that's, I think it means there's a fungibility to the kinds of dating issues.
Yeah, not like on Facebook these days, instantaneous. Yeah.
Those were the days, really. There's a question here. to Professor Zastoupil you talked about women wearing his locks in their lockets. Was it something that became popular in the US, or was there a similar trend in Britain?
Yes, this was common in the Western world. I can't vouch. I haven't done research on it, but I do know that locks, and the lockets usually just had a strand or two. That's why the sale I mentioned had 6 locks and 6 strands of his hair that were sent. For those who couldn't afford as much, they would buy just a single strand. They would put it in a locket, and this was very common in Britain and in North America, and I assume across Europe. Keepsakes of famous, or it didn't have to be a famous person, it could be an ordinary person.
Yes.
There's even a famous poem by Alexander Pope, The Rape of the Lock, and it's about a lock of hair issue anyway, and that was in the 18th century.
I don't see other questions, so Amit, what do you say?
Yeah, I
Unless
think
you have a question yourself, please.
I do not have a question, but definitely this discussion was very interesting. So maybe we can talk about this after on a different topic, maybe if we have the time in future, because what Professor Zastoupil had said about, this Trinitarianism added by the later, at a particular time after the death of Christ, most probably during the Roman period. So maybe we can discuss then later on, say, about how the Greek Orthodox Church still remained focused on the Unitarian part, whereas the Trinitarian part went to the standard form of Christianity. So maybe that can be kept for another day.
And I was just wondering if they would be kind enough at some point to share the papers with us, because they need to be read and reread.
Yes, definitely.
There was
Mr. Amit Das.
Yes.
I have a suggestion. This is Raju from Bangalore.
Yeah, hello, Mr. Raju.
Why not we collect all the topics which they have delivered in every occasion, publish in a small booklet that will be very useful to the others who have not participated in the Zoom meeting.
Yeah, definitely, Mr. Raju. That's a very good suggestion. So we have really given thoughts on this. We are going to collect the written copies. But in any case, these lectures are also available on YouTube. So anyone can log into YouTube and watch the replay of these sessions. But your point is taken. We'll definitely look at collecting the physical copies of these lectures and
yeah, thank you. Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Amit.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Raju.
So thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Mike, for two wonderful talks and for giving us so much to think about. And thank you, Amit, for organizing this.
Yeah.
And
a special thanks to you, Tanika, for being the chair today and conducting the meeting. That
was pure pleasure.
And thank you, Professor Zastoupil and Dr. Fisher. So we look to connecting with you soon in future. These lectures will be available on YouTube. I'll share the links with you, and also the links of on the sessions that will be coming up. So thank you once again, and a big thanks to all those who had joined in and listened patiently. So thank you once again. We are ending the session here. The links will be available on YouTube. Thank you. Have a nice day, nice evening. Good night.